Welcome to the LDS Mental Health Podcast. This is a podcast for faithful women who want healing in their relationships, guidance from God, and internal peace. Each week, you'll hear mental health concepts taught through a spiritual lens from me, a licensed clinical mental health counselor, to help you start thinking in a higher and holier way. All right, I'm so excited to welcome a guest to the podcast this week. We have Claire Breedlove. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she has a really fun niche where she helps people with OCD and scrupulosity. So welcome, Claire.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about this topic. I think it's one that needs to be talked about more often. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Maybe your family, how you got into this specialty.
Yeah, so I am a social worker, but that was not my first career. I was actually in the Foreign Service for about 10 years and lived all over the world, and then moved back to the US, to the Bay Area, and became a social worker. I worked in a psychiatric hospital for a long
Wow.
time, and then decided to transition into private practice.
Mm.
And a very wise friend suggested that I would like doing treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder,
Oh,
because the treatment for OCD is very specific. It's
yeah,
exposure therapy. And you kind of have to have a certain personality, certain sense of humor to be
yeah,
interested in that kind of work.
yeah,
And so my friend very wisely saw that that was a good fit for me. So
yeah,
I started working with people with obsessive compulsive disorder. And there's a what we call a theme of OCD that's focused on religion,
yeah.
that's called scrupulosity. And a lot of people who have scrupulosity are afraid to seek treatment because they're afraid that the therapist is gonna tell them the treatment is leaving the church.
Uh,
So I started getting these calls and referrals here and there of people who knew I was a member of the church and that I also happened to know how to treat people with OCD. And they
yeah,
asked me, hey, do you think like you could take this case? Maybe this could work.
yeah,
And so I started treating a few people with scrupulosity here and there, and then realized that there was actually a pretty big need.
yeah.
And so the treatment for scrupulosity is absolutely not leaving the church. It's other
Yes,
things.
yeah.
But I think, I feel like I'm in kind of a special place that, because of my activity in the church, I'm able to use my professional training to help
Yeah.
people who are dealing with this problem.
I love that. Absolutely. I didn't even think about that. That would be maybe a barrier to people reaching out for treatment. And it probably is more of a comforting thing to know, my religion, right? Like, um, the intricacies of different things and why that might be. So yeah, that makes total sense. So for someone who is sitting here and they're like, what is scrupulosity? Maybe let's start there. So if you're
Yeah.
describing it as
So
somebody who's never heard of it.
Yeah, so scrupulosity, for people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we tend to see a few big things. First is an obsessive concern that you're not worthy, that you're not good enough, you're not worthy to go into the temple. You need to go see your bishop every week because there's something that you need to repent for, like
Mm.
a really just like deep feeling of not being good enough.
Yeah.
We also tend to see people are afraid that they don't have enough faith, that they're not having the kinds of spiritual experiences that they want because they don't believe enough, even though their heart is there. Like they love the gospel. They want to be in the temple. They want to be serving in their church callings. This is important to them. This is where their values are, but they're having all this anxiety and these obsessive concerns that are getting in the way.
Would that
And
also be
then
somebody
also,
who's like struggling with, I've never felt the spirit before, like I do all of these things, but I never feel the spirit? Is that sort of that direction too?
I
Or more
mean,
about worthiness?
it's more about like worthiness. I mean, I think there's sometimes people get really mixed up that they can't distinguish between what's their anxiety and what's the
Yeah.
spirit.
Yeah.
So they're feeling like I'm not reading my scriptures enough, I'm not wearing my garments correctly, I'm not going to the temple enough, all these things. And they think that that's coming from the spirit. They think that's coming from God.
Okay.
But in reality, that's anxiety. Like Heavenly Father
Yeah.
speak to us like that. That's how anxiety speaks to us.
Yeah.
So, and then we also tend to see, compulsive behaviors that people are engaging in to try and manage the obsessive thoughts, to try to manage the anxieties. So this could be like, compulsive prayer, need to repent really often, spending hours a day listening to conference talks, just really unhealthy engagement with different religious practices that's driven by anxiety. That's the key part. So
Never
this
getting
doesn't feel
relief.
good to you. It's not something you want to be doing.
Yeah.
It feels wrong, like not wrong, but icky.
Yeah. And it does it feel kind of like you never feel relief from that. You never feel like the more that you do those, the more you have to do more of them because the anxiety is increasing. It's not like I do that and that felt good, so I want to do more of it. There's
Right. So we talk about like the OCD cycle. So like if you feel like, you have this like compulsive need to read your scriptures. And so you spend an hour reading the scriptures and maybe you feel better for a little bit, but then shortly after you're like, oh no, that wasn't enough. I need to read it. Like I need to read even more. And so
yeah.
that's really different than, a typical experience of reading the scriptures where, you read, you study, you feel like you've learned
Yeah.
something, you feel closer to Heavenly Father, and you go about your day.
Right, right, right. Or you increase your scripture time because it feels good and or you go to the temple more often because you notice there's results from that. So you're increasing that. Not the same though. That
Right.
is results driven, not anxiety driven behind
Yeah, and
that.
we spend a lot of time in therapy for scrupulosity, helping people, make values-based decisions about their spiritual lives as opposed to anxiety-based decisions. And that's hard for people to disentangle at first, but over time it
Yeah.
works out.
Okay. Okay. So any other kind of things that distinguish scrupulosity for those that are wondering about what it is?
Yeah. So scrupulosity is, you know, like many other forms of OCD. So it's pretty unusual to just see scrupulosity in a vacuum. Most people I see are also experiencing other OCD symptoms. So by far the most common kind of co-occurring set of OCD symptoms I see with members of the church is something called relationship OCD. So
Mm.
this is where people have a lot of anxiety that in their closest relationships, their relationships with their parents, with their spouse, with their children, that, they're not secure, that they're not, that the other person doesn't really love them, that things are going to fall apart, they're going to end up alone, and they're spending a lot of time seeking reassurance, doing a lot of checking, trying to be, trying to feel like it's all okay.
Yeah.
Um, and what we see is that people who have scrupulosity, people with OCD, kind of in general, they have a really difficult time tolerating any kind of uncertainty.
Mm.
So, with whatever kind of OCD theme they're dealing with, they always want to be 100% sure of everything. But of course,
Yeah.
that's not possible.
You
So it
never
sets you up
can.
for this really brutal
Yeah.
cycle of seeking reassurance and then feeling okay temporarily, but then, the symptoms keep coming back.
So that's so interesting. Do you ever see somebody who has scrupulosity but not OCD, or do they always have OCD in order to have scrupulosity?
Yeah, so they always have OCD.
Okay.
So scrupulosity is like a sub kind of variant of OCD.
Hmm.
So when I assess, like if you come to see me, and I assess you like at the first appointment, you'll do a few assessments, but the main two are, there's one assessment called the Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale that's just, used in the United States for like everybody with OCD. And
Yeah.
then there's a scrupulosity specific scale.
Okay.
And, you know, for 95% of the people that I see, they have clinical OCD as well as, a
Okay.
comparable scrupulosity score.
What would be some symptoms of just OCD that aren't related to scrupulosity if someone's sort of looking at that and saying, this might be me?
So the kind of classic that everyone thinks of is contamination OCD. So hand washing and those kinds of things, worried that, there are germs that are going to hurt you in your environment. People can have, OCD symptoms about health-related concerns. People can have OCD symptoms related to harm. So a fear that they are inadvertently going to harm someone else.
Mm,
Um, People can have pedophile OCD symptoms where they're
mm,
afraid that they're going to inadvertently harm children. And the key thing that, you know, that the thread that runs through all of these themes is that the OCD, the obsessive thoughts are always what we call ego dystonic. So it's not something that is consistent with the person's values. It's not what they want to do. So if somebody with harm OCD is having an obsessive thought that they're going to, hurt their husband, they don't actually want to do that. They're the
yeah.
last person in the world who would do that. That's why the OCD is so painful. And
Mm,
so similarly with scrupulosity, like people with scrupulosity are the last people who would ever want to leave the church. Like
yeah.
that's why the symptoms they're experiencing are so upsetting to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting. So I had so many questions just come to my mind. Like, where to go from here? Okay, so if someone is maybe helping has a loved one that they're concerned about, do you have specific things that they can sort of look at, or might be clues or things that they might pick up on to say this person might be having scrupulosity, or are there things that they can sort of distinguish, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big things, almost everyone with OCD with scrupulosity is going to be engaged in some kind of reassurance seeking behavior because
Mm,
that uncertainty that something might be wrong is really, really difficult for them to handle. So they're almost always going to the people that they're closest to and asking, like, do you think this is okay? Like, what do you think? Did I do the right thing? Am I okay? Like, do you really think I'm okay to take the sacrament? Am I okay to go to the temple? And, our instinct is, I think, with the people we love is to say, like, yes, of course, you're perfect. Like, you're great. Like, why are you even worried about this?
right.
And that, maybe with someone with OCD, it might make things better in the moment, but you're just fueling that cycle that we talked about earlier.
Mm,
So, one of the best things you can do, I think, if you have a loved one who's highly anxious, you think they might have OCD, is simply ask the question, like, are you gonna, is this an information seeking question or is this coming from anxiety? Are you gonna be comfortable with the first answer I give you, or do you think you're gonna need to ask me again and like after this?
oh,
And if they are like, no, I just need to know this and I'm gonna be good, then it's not OCD. But if they get uncomfortable and think like, oh, well, no, I don't know, I'm probably gonna need to ask you like a few more
yeah,
times,
yeah.
then maybe that's an invitation to have a conversation about anxiety and what kinds of other things might be going on.
Yes. Interesting. So, what is the treatment for scrupulosity? Let's dive in there because you mentioned a little bit about it, like values based and addressing some of those things. So, someone comes into your office, they receive that diagnosis. What are you explaining to them about how treatment goes?
So the treatment for scrupulosity for OCD is two things. It's a high dose of an SSRI antidepressant, and it is a therapy called exposure and response prevention. And the really good news is that the success rate for the combination of these two things is like 80%. It's incredibly high.
Yeah.
Um, and so, the SSRI you can talk to your doctor about. For the exposure and response prevention, the idea is it's like really simple. So it's simply the premise that if you learn how to face your fears, like you're not going to be afraid of it anymore.
Mhm.
So, to use an example that's, different than scrupulosity, if, you come to me and you're like, I'm really afraid of snakes and it's causing a lot of problems in my life, I'll start out and maybe show you a picture of a snake and you'll see it and your anxiety will spike up. But then, it eventually is going to come down because anxiety is temporary and it's never dangerous. So
Mhm.
you have that experience and then I show you the picture again. But this time your anxiety is maybe a little bit less because you just had that first experience. And then
Yeah.
we do this over and over again. And then when you're comfortable with the picture, maybe we move on to a video, do the same thing. And then after that, maybe you're at the zoo and you're, standing 5 feet away from the snake through the glass. You do that for a while. And then eventually, like you're at the pet store, you're holding the snake.
Yeah.
So, of course, with scrupulosity, with ideas, with, you know, religion,
Non-tangible things that
it's
you
not a
can be
tangible
exposed. Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
but we can do exposures and we do exposures in lots of ways. So sometimes we'll have you create scripts of, that say you have a fear of, you're worried that you're not worthy to enter the temple and you're about to get married. So we'll, write a script where we explore like the underlying fears behind that anxiety. Like, why are you so worried about this? Like, are you worried that, you're not going to be able to get married? You're not going to be able to have an eternal family, like whatever it is. And then we set up a schedule, we give you structure so that you expose yourself to the ideas just as you would, the snake in the first example. So it's, we get kind of creative. Like I have all kinds of people do exposures using like temple recommended questions and
Mhm.
conference talks. Like I have, a few people doing exposures at the temple this week. So I think
Awesome.
that's where it's really helpful that obviously like I know what an endowment ceremony is like. So I
Right,
understand what parts of that might be
right.
difficult for people. And so, we can really tailor the exposures to the specifics of what's triggering the anxiety.
And when you talk exposure to these things prior to exposing people to these anxiety provoking things, I'm sure you're teaching tools to decrease anxiety along with that, right? And helping them understand how to decrease that body tension, mind clutter, based symptoms that come up, right?
Yeah, so we definitely kind of spend a good amount of time laying a foundation where we talk about, like common cognitive distortions, so kind of like messed up ways of thinking that are common
Mm.
with for people with OCD. And we talk about, we've spent a lot of time talking about just like what I call the overimportance of thoughts. So,
Hmm.
for people who have OCD, for people who have scrupulosity, intrusive thoughts are really bothersome for them. And it's like kind of mind blowing when they learn that like everybody has intrusive thoughts. Like we have like 50,000 thoughts a day, and
Right.
everybody has like bizarre thoughts. Everybody has weird sexual thoughts. Everybody has violent thoughts. Like it's just part of being a human being with a brain. But
Right.
if you don't have OCD, it's a lot easier for you to just kind of process that in one ear out the other. But if you have OCD, those thoughts get really sticky and you start to
Yeah.
think, well, maybe this means something about me. Like maybe I need to do something about this. And so we spend a lot of time just kind of processing that, like, maybe you don't. Maybe a thought is
Yeah.
just a thought.
Yeah.
Um, and so some things like that I think um, are really important for being able to tolerate the exposures, but also for being able just to understand, kind of what's going on with the OCD.
You mentioned part of the treatment is a high dose of SSRIs. Um, I think sometimes when I have clients come in, a lot of times they wonder, like, did I do something to cause this? And when I hear you say that that's necessary, what that triggers in my mind is this is a genetic thing, right?
Yeah.
This is chemically based.
Yes.
Can you speak to a little bit more about that so that people sort of understand, like, nobody does something to cause scrupulosity in their life
Yeah.
or OCD or
No, and I mean we actually know that the incidence of scrupulosity is it's basically the same across religions and actually non religious people get it as well. I
Mm.
mean, I did an intake last week with a woman who's not religious but has, what we call moral OCD. So basically scrupulosity in a non-religious person.
Wow.
So it happens
Yeah.
across the board, and we know that it runs in families. There is a really strong genetic component, and researchers are actually working right now to identify, a set of genes that is associated with OCD. And then we also know that, there are kind of two typical like waves of onset for OCD. So there's a small portion of people who will get it as children. And interestingly, when I work with little kids, like below the age of 10, a lot of the work is really just with the parents around reducing accommodation, not providing reassurance, and it works really well.
Hmm.
But then the second age of kind of typical wave of onset is really interesting in our community because it's mission age, late teens, early
Mm.
20s.
Okay.
And so, we see kind of, it's not anything that they've done. It's just kind of this perfect storm of genetics, environment, timing, stress,
Hmm.
whatever.
That
And
transition to adulthood is a stressful
yeah.
time for a lot of mental health
Yeah.
diagnoses to come out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really is just, it's the same timeline as with, a lot of other major mental health conditions. So
So genetic, chemically based too, right? Like that, do you see people recovering if they don't take medication?
I do, people who have less complicated OCD and less severe OCD tend to have more success with just therapy alone. Um, I think, you know, unless there's some really compelling reason why, and I mean, I always tell people like, okay, if you don't want to take meds, like let's do it, let's try some exposure and
Yeah.
see how it goes. And if they're able to tolerate the exposures, they're making progress, great.
Mhm.
But for some people, the medication is really important in helping them be able to manage the thoughts more
Yeah.
effectively. So
Yeah.
it's really an important part of being able to do the behavioral therapy.
Yes. Yeah, I was just thinking in my mind, like when you talked about thoughts being sticky, it almost makes those thoughts less sticky, right?
Exactly.
Is
Exactly.
that the medication can help those thoughts just breeze on through a lot easier, and you don't have to do as much work,
Yeah.
right? And I think I get sometimes people feel medication is, has some stigma around it sometimes, or the side effects of that. Um, and so or they want more natural ways to do it than a medication. But I like that approach too, where we can say, let's try it without it. We'll see how it goes and see what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, I definitely have, lots of like very young clients who don't take any meds. Um, and yeah, and people, it kind of, one of the cool things I think about exposure is that, the idea is that you spend kind of some intensive time in treatment learning how to do the therapy, learning how to do the exposures. But then once you kind of complete that initial phase of treatment, we want you to be able to identify where up and then do your own exposure on your own. And so for people who get really good at that and feel really comfortable with it, a lot of those people will have success coming off their medications. But it really, kind of it's so individual, and I think it really just depends on, symptoms, preferences, how good you are at ERP, like all those kinds of things.
I like that. Like use it as a fortification to help you learn these tools so that you have an easier time sort of implementing these tools. And as you strengthen your ability to use them, then the medication can decrease because you have some strength built behind it.
Exactly. And like exposure is hard. Like
Really
there
hard.
like under normal circumstances, most people aren't like, yes, I want to repeatedly face my deepest, darkest fear.
Right? Yeah.
And so, like the people I work with, they're incredibly brave because it's not an easy path. It's a rewarding path. But it's a lot. And I think, I always want my clients to have the best possible chance at meeting their goals. And, for a lot of people that involves medication.
Yeah. So you mentioned for family members or loved ones who are supporting them, if they reduce accommodations, they reduce reassurance. What does that look like, or what do you mean by accommodations and reassurance in regards to scrupulosity?
So, I mean, I'll give you a few examples
Yeah.
of accommodations. So, like, I have a client who, when I first, 13-year-old girl, and when I first started working with her mom was letting her have an hour a day of what they called worry time. So the idea was to give her a dedicated time to talk about all of her anxieties so that she could like get it out of her system. And so the first thing I did when, they started working with me was say to get rid of the worry time. Like this is making things worse.
Yeah.
And so they were really skeptical. But like a few weeks later, the girl, said to me, she was like, yeah, like I don't even miss it anymore. Because it basically put her in a position where she had to figure out how to manage the anxiety on her own. And she
Yeah.
was able to do
When it
that.
came up, not
Yeah.
according to the time period. Yeah.
Right, right. So she, it turned out she was totally capable all along of
Yeah.
handling all this stuff.
Yes.
But like we didn't know
Yeah.
until the mom like stopped doing the worry time. And like similarly, like I have a client right now who is really worried that her husband's going to leave the church. And so every time he looks at his phone during sacrament meeting, she freaks out.
Yeah.
And so he had agreed to like not look at it for a while.
That
And
was
I
his
said,
accommodation.
that was his accommodation. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
was like, you know what, you check your email or whatever you need to be doing during sacrament meeting.
Yeah.
Because what had happened was like once he stopped looking at the phone, she started and was like, well, he's not singing all the words to the hymns. Like maybe, so
Moves
it
to
just
the next
kind of
thing.
turned into
Yeah.
something else. So,
Yeah.
it's like so much of OCD treatment, it's counterintuitive, but you kind of have to look to the bigger picture of like, am I doing something that might be actually just contributing to the anxiety cycle, to the OCD cycle?
Mm. Yes. Yeah. Are we making this accommodation or reassuring them over and over and over again that doesn't decrease the anxiety? These things actually increase the anxiety for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's not like I like don't want people to tell their loved ones that like they love them or, anything or
Right,
something like
right, right,
that.
right,
But it's a frequency issue.
right,
So, answer the question once, don't answer the question 15 times,
right,
you know.
right. Yeah, that's a good distinction with that, right? That's good. Um, Sometimes, and I read this sort of on your website that scrupulosity is not synonymous with a faith crisis. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's really common for people with scrupulosity to feel like they're having all these symptoms because they don't have enough faith.
Mm,
But I like can't emphasize enough that scrupulosity it's a mental health problem. It's an anxiety disorder. It's
mhm.
not a problem of faith.
Right.
It seems like it might be because it has religious content,
Hmm.
but that's not at all what it is. And to kind of go back to the idea about, OCD involving ego dystonic thoughts, that OCD it's really slippery and it's really painful. And so often we see that it latches on to things that are most important in people's lives. So like clients with scrupulosity, like I've learned so much from them about the gospel
Mm,
because they're actually like they're so strong in their faith, but
yeah.
they just have these mental health symptoms that have gotten in the way.
Mhm.
And that's totally different than, when you meet somebody who's having a faith crisis and they actually have like values-based questions about whether or not they want to remain in the church that
Right.
have nothing to do with anxiety.
Right.
It's a totally different thing.
Yes. Yes, that's a good distinction. It's not about the anxiety they're feeling and why they're bringing these conversations up or talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So now you practice therapy with us and not a coaching business, but so sometimes with therapy that comes with you need to be licensed in different states and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about how you provide treatment for people, who you provide that treatment to, and if that aligns with them, how they might seek you out?
Sure. So I do provide therapy, not coaching, and I'm licensed in California, Utah, Idaho, Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. So I can see people who are in any of those states. And so you can just go to my website. It's mountainhomeocd.com. And my contact information is on there, and there's a bunch of information about intake rates, all that kind of stuff.
Okay, awesome. I'll definitely link that in the show notes so they can do that. Do you, and another question I get all the time is like, do you take insurance?
I do
And
not take insurance,
yeah,
unfortunately. But I do have a bunch of information on my site. You can put your information in and see what your reimbursement would be. And I provide like super bills to all my clients that they can use to submit for reimbursement if they want to.
awesome. What's one thing that you feel like people need to understand about scrupulosity?
You're not doing anything wrong. Um,
Mm,
it's not, you're not doing anything wrong, and it's not a faith crisis.
yeah.
That this is a really treatable mental health condition. Before I was in private practice, I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and most of my clients were extremely ill, and they would cycle through the hospital. They didn't get better.
Mm.
And now it's exactly the opposite, that my clients do get better. They're able to, put in the work, do the exposures, like they get this really cool perspective on their faith and kind of this really wild ride that many of them have had. And then they come out and they're able to go and do what they want. So, I have a couple clients right now who are, getting ready to leave on missions, which were big goals of theirs. I have another client right now who's just gone back into the temple out of after many years away, which was one of his big goals.
Wow.
So it's awesome to be able to see people like actually get to where they want to be, to have the kind of relationship with Heavenly Father, with their spirituality that they want.
I love that. There's hope in the diagnosis that this is not kind of a life sentence that they have to be in despair or anxiety or anguish the rest of their lives.
And it's not even like, I mean, I love my clients, but I always tell them, like, we are not going to be doing this for like years and years. Like,
Yeah.
exposure is generally a pretty short-term treatment. So, it's pretty amazing to get to be a part of, because people see big changes really quickly often.
I like that. You said that earlier. Like, if you are learning these skills and understanding how to identify your triggers and apply it, like, you don't have to keep going to therapy because you understand the process of the exposure therapy, right? So you can apply this to any obsession or compulsion that comes up and know that you can handle it without another person
Yeah,
to help you
absolutely.
with
And
that.
I do have like people who will come back to me for like, I call them like tune-ups, like maybe they have a baby or they move, or there's something big
Yeah,
that's going on
big
and they need
change.
a little
Yeah.
bit more support, and that's totally fine. But for the most part, it's like, yeah, I have a colleague who talks about like living the exposure lifestyle. Like, I
Oh,
want you to be able to go off and like do whatever you want to do. And
yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love that. There's definitely hope and the skills are valuable and once you learn them, you can be strengthened in your life with that. I love that.
yeah,
That's
I mean, I
awesome.
think a lot of my clients feel like, if they've faced these fears and learned how to like just deal with it head on, like they can do anything.
That's so true. Yeah, that empowerment that they gain from facing the worst fears that are currently on their mind, that power can translate to anything.
Yeah.
Love that. Claire, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming on the
you.
podcast, talking about this. This is an awesome topic. And definitely, if anybody's listening to this, you identify with this, or I was just thinking as we were talking, I was like, man, this would be a good episode for bishops to listen to. If you have a bishop in your
Oh,
life, have them
yeah.
listen to that because they probably are seeing people with some of those symptoms coming in. And so
Yes, and I do actually, many people with scrupulosity have misunderstood the like spectrum of issues that you need to go talk to your bishop about. If you look
yeah.
at the handbook, it is quite small, quite narrow. So
Yes.
we do
Yes.
sometimes talk about that in therapy.
Yes. And so bishops might be seeing some of these individuals that are having this struggle. So this would be a good episode to share with them as well. So thank you so much for coming on. We'll link your website in the show notes so people can reach out to you. And thanks for coming on.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the LDS Mental Health Podcast. I hope you were able to find ways of healing, guidance, and peace. If you liked this episode, please share it with a friend who would love to start thinking in a higher and holier way as well. Or hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any episodes. Also, check out the links in my show notes for other episodes you might like and links for other mental health resources on my website.